You usually think of a historical masterpiece as something that simply descended from the heavens.
Hmm.
Picture a flawless marble statue that just appeared one day. Fully formed, pristine, and, absolutely perfect.
A monument entirely untouched by ordinary human struggles or daily anxieties. People often prefer to imagine that great art is born in a vacuum of pure, unadulterated inspiration.
Exactly. But then you look at the origins of George Frideric Handel's Messiah, and, well, that flawless marble starts to look a lot more like clay
Clay shaped by sheer desperation.
and outright defiance. Plus, a very large brass button, which we will get to. Welcome to this deep dive.
We are so glad to have you with us.
Our mission today is to pull from a collection of historical articles, society archives, and documentaries to explore the deeply personal, surprisingly chaotic human life of Handel.
And from there, we will examine how that turbulent life birthed his most enduring musical masterpiece.
Because we are diving into the origins of a profoundly religious text, our sources naturally delve into Christian theology, biblical prophecies, and historical debates, such as 18th century deism.
So we want to make our approach clear. Our goal today is to look at the historical facts. We are exploring what motivated these individuals without taking a theological stance ourselves. We will simply unpack the historical context of the music.
A measured historical exploration of the facts. To understand the force of will required to write a piece like Messiah, it helps to build our conversation in a few distinct chapters.
That makes it much clearer to follow.
Let us open chapter 1, the smuggled clavichord and the brass button.
I love this title.
We first need to look at the extreme stubbornness that defined the composer's early life.
That stubbornness began in Halle, Germany, where Handel was born in 1685.
So late 17th century.
Correct. His father was a prominent town surgeon and court valet. In that era, a surgeon was a highly practical, serious profession.
Very no-nonsense.
Exactly. And his father had very strict, pragmatic plans for his son. He demanded that Handel study law.
Of course.
He completely banned music in the house, viewing the life of a musician as financially uncertain and, frankly, entirely frivolous.
Banning music in the house entirely is such a fascinating psychological misstep.
How so?
Well, it is the 17th century equivalent of forbidding a born athlete from ever running or, confiscating a teenager's smartphone today.
Ah, I see the comparison.
Absolute restrictions usually backfire. They only fuel a rebellious determination to pursue the forbidden interest at all costs.
The prohibition certainly backfired in the Handel household. Handel's mother actually secretly smuggled a small keyboard instrument.
Wait, she smuggled it?
She did. She smuggled a clavichord into a room at the top of the house.
To the attic.
Exactly. A clavichord is incredibly quiet, making it the perfect instrument for covert practice. Handel would sneak up to the attic to play in secret while his father slept.
That secret practice eventually paid off. Because when Handel was 9 years old, he accompanied his father to a nearby town, and he found his way to a harpsichord in the local palace chapel. He simply sat down and started playing.
And the local duke, Johann Adolf, happened to hear him playing in the chapel.
Talk about being in the right place at the right time.
Truly. The duke was so astounded by the young boy's talent that he strongly urged Handel's reluctant father to permit formal music lessons.
And considering the instruction came from a duke.
The father finally relented. He really had no choice.
So that early childhood stubbornness evolved into an intense, fiery pride as he grew older.
It absolutely did.
Fast forward to his early career in Hamburg.
Yeah.
Handel was playing second violin in an orchestra.
And his friend, Johann Mattheson, was the composer and lead actor in an opera called The Misfortune of Cleopatra.
The mechanics of the performance dictated that Matheson was supposed to return to the orchestra pit to conduct after his character died on stage in the third act.
But the situation in the pit devolved rapidly. The primary conductor, Reinhard Kaiser, had a severe gambling and drinking problem.
Oh my.
Feeling unwell, Kaiser abruptly left the performance halfway through.
Just walked out.
So Handel immediately took over the harpsichord and assumed the conducting duties to keep the opera going.
Which makes sense. But when Matheson's character died on stage and he came down into the pit to reclaim his conductor's seat, Handel simply refused to move.
He would not give it up. The two young men argued fiercely in whispers while the music continued to play.
That professional dispute escalated into an actual sword duel outside the theater immediately after the performance.
An actual sword duel. It was a genuinely near-fatal encounter.
Incredible.
Matheson lunged and thrust his sword directly at Handel's chest.
And this is where the brass button comes in.
Exactly. Handel's life was miraculously saved because the blade struck a large brass button on his coat, glancing off a thick musical score he had tucked into his shirt.
A musical score literally saved his life.
The near miss frightened them both so profoundly that they put their swords away and remained lifelong friends.
It is incredible to think the man who survived a street duel over a harpsichord seat is the same man who wrote the definitive soundtrack to the holiday season.
It really is a striking contrast.
That exact same stubborn determination carried him to London. Which brings us to Chapter 2, The Quirky Expatriate in Crisis.
A very fitting title.
In London, he faced a completely different kind of battle, involving shifting public tastes and the looming threat of financial ruin.
Handel became a naturalized British citizen and lived in a comfortable Georgian house on Brook Street in Mayfair for nearly 40 years.
For a long time, he was the undisputed entrepreneurial star of Italian opera in London. He was producing lavish, expensive spectacles.
Italian opera was essentially the blockbuster cinema of its day. Massive budgets, superstar singers, intricate stage sets, and high drama.
But public tastes are notoriously fickle.
Precisely. By the time Handel reached his 50s, the London audiences were suffering from Italian opera fatigue.
They were just tired of it.
They were losing interest in the genre entirely, and rival opera companies were cannibalizing the remaining audience.
He suddenly found himself in a severe career and financial crisis.
It was a very dark period for him.
To humanize the man behind this mounting anxiety, consider his behavior at his own dinner parties during this period.
Oh, this is a wonderful detail.
Handel loved food to such an extent that he would fake a sudden burst of musical inspiration during a meal.
He would excuse himself to the back room, pretending he needed to urgently write down a melody.
In reality, he was secretly consuming the best food and wine he had hidden away before returning to his guests.
It paints a vivid picture of a man who was undeniably brilliant, but also deeply flawed, anxious, and prone to excess.
Compounding his professional decline, the Bishop of London also banned the performance of religious works on theatrical stages,
which severely limited Handel's options for generating income.
The catalyst for his salvation came from his wealthy friend, Charles Jennens.
Jennens sent Handel a compiled libretto of biblical texts.
Because Jennens was fighting his own personal and philosophical battles. He dealt with chronic depression and was trying to counter the growing Enlightenment movement of deism.
Deism in the 18th century was essentially the belief that God created the universe like a clockmaker.
Winding it up and then stepping back.
Exactly. Letting it run without any further divine intervention. Deists often rejected miracles and viewed Jesus merely as a good moral teacher rather than a divine figure.
Jennens wanted to aggressively counter that philosophy. He wanted to emphasize the divinity of Jesus and prove that he fulfilled ancient prophecies through active divine intervention.
So Jennens carefully selected verses from the Old and New Testaments. He organized them into a three-part structure that mirrored an opera.
But notably lacked a traditional narrative plot or specific characters.
Correct.
Wait, I need to stop and look closely at this dynamic.
Go ahead.
If Jennens selected the specific verses, built the entire three-part architectural structure, and had the underlying philosophical motive to combat deism, wasn't Handel essentially just a gun for hire here?
That is a very pointed question.
I mean, is Messiah actually Jennens' masterpiece, with Handel simply providing a commercial vehicle for Jennens' theological agenda?
That is a highly debated perspective. Jennens certainly provided the conceptual architecture and the exact text.
Right. I mean, excuse me, he literally handed him the script.
He did. He even explicitly wrote to a friend that he hoped Handel would expend his best efforts on the text so it would become his best oratorio.
So Jennens knew exactly what he was doing.
However, calling Handel a mere gun for hire ignores the transformative power of his composition. Jennens provided the skeleton, but Handel provided the soul and the enduring emotional resonance.
I see.
Handel needed a success to avoid financial ruin, and Jennens provided the perfect material at the exact moment. Handel needed a new direction.
An oratorio was significantly cheaper to produce than a full Italian opera because it required no costumes, no elaborate sets, and no foreign superstar divas.
It was a financially sound gamble for a struggling composer.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, 24 Days of Feverish Creation.
Armed with Jennens' text and driven by the urgent need to save his failing career, Handel retreated into an unprecedented period of isolation.
He composed the entire 259-page score in just 24 days.
We are talking about roughly 250,000 individual notes.
He worked feverishly in his Brook Street house, barely eating or sleeping.
At one point, his servant found him in tears at his desk over the creation of the Hallelujah Chorus.
Tears of exhaustion or joy.
Profound spiritual emotion. Handel reportedly exclaimed that he thought he saw all heaven before him and the great God himself seated on his throne.
The sheer speed of that creation fuels the legend of divine inspiration. Writing a masterpiece of that scale in 24 days seems physically impossible to a modern observer.
We must ground this myth in historical reality to truly appreciate his skill. Professional composers of that era regularly wrote music at the speed we write letters today.
It wasn't entirely unusual.
Handel was thoroughly accustomed to strict deadlines. Furthermore, he was highly pragmatic and often recycled his own earlier melodies to save time.
He actually repurposed several of his old Italian love duets for the grand choruses in Messiah.
He did.
There was a fascinating irony in secular love songs being slightly altered to become some of the most famous sacred choruses in history.
The true miracle is not the sheer speed of the composition, but the unmatched, enduring quality of the mechanics within the work. Every movement is meticulously crafted to serve the emotional weight of the text.
The musical genius is evident in his specific technical choices. He frequently used a technique called text painting.
A beautiful technique.
This means making the music physically reflect the literal meaning of the words being sung.
Precisely. For example, when the choir sings the word stand, the music hangs perfectly still on a single, unwavering chord.
That is brilliant.
When they sing the word sleep, the melody slides gently downward, mimicking the physical act of lying down or drifting off.
And when they sing about a mountain,
the notes climb sharply. The music acts as a physical illustration of the text.
Furthermore, he showed remarkable restraint with his instrumentation. He held back the trumpets for most of the piece,
which was very deliberate.
They're only heard briefly in part one, and then he completely reserves them for key climactic moments like the Hallelujah Chorus and the final triumphant movements.
This deliberate withholding maximizes their dramatic impact. When those trumpets finally enter the soundscape, they completely alter the energy in the room.
He also layered the voices with incredible complexity. The Hallelujah Chorus is a prime example of imitative counterpoint, specifically a technique called fugal writing.
We hear the term fugue often, but the actual mechanics of it are rarely explained clearly.
A fugue is essentially a highly sophisticated musical echo that builds into a tidal wave.
Exactly. One section of the choir, say the sopranos, introduces a short, distinct melody.
A few seconds later, the altos enter with that exact same melody, while the sopranos move on to a counter melody.
Then the tenors enter with the initial theme, and finally, the basses.
You end up with these contrasting speeds building incredible tension. You have the slow, stately voices singing King of Kings, moving steadily underneath the fast, energetic voices repeating, Hallelujah.
It creates a dense, overlapping texture that feels overwhelmingly powerful.
Once the ink dried on this frantic, meticulously layered creation, bringing it to the stage proved to be another massive hurdle.
Entirely due to the strict social norms of the era.
This leads us to Chapter 4, the Dublin Triumph and the London Scandal.
Handel decided to premiere the work not in London, where his reputation was currently struggling, but in Dublin, Ireland, in April 1742.
It was presented as a charity concert at the Great Music Hall on Fishamble Street. To maximize attendance and raise as much money as possible, the organizers made highly specific requests of the audience in the local paper.
Men were formally asked to leave their swords at home.
And women were asked to abandon their large hoop skirts.
Those specific wardrobe adjustments allowed the venue to squeeze 700 people into a space designed for 600.
The Dublin premiere was an unmitigated success. The proceeds resulted in the release of 142 indebted prisoners and provided significant funds to local hospitals.
A local clergyman was so moved by the contralto Susanna Sibber singing the Uri aria he was despised that he stood up in the middle of the performance and shouted, "Woman, for this be all thy sins forgiven thee."
Contrast that profound triumph with a London premiere a year later.
It was a completely different reception.
High society in London was completely outraged.
They believed a secular theater was an entirely inappropriate place to perform sacred texts.
To some religious minds in London, flaunting the life of Christ on a secular stage bordered on outright blasphemy.
They were particularly scandalized by Handel's choice of performers. He used secular theater actresses with controversial public pasts to sing the holy words.
Susanna Sibber, the very same singer who moved the clergyman to tears in Dublin, was involved in a highly publicized, scandalous divorce suit in London at the time.
Her presence deeply offended the religious sensibilities of the London critics.
Because of the massive public backlash, the London reception was freezing cold. Handel even tried to advertise the performance simply as a new sacred oratorio,
Just to avoid printing the sacred word Messiah on a profane theater poster.
It took several years and numerous charity performances for the work to finally gain traction and respect in England.
Despite that initial resistance, the piece survived the scandal to become a global phenomenon.
As political stability eventually returned to Britain following periods of rebellion, the triumphant unifying choruses resonated with a newly confident British Empire.
The music evolved from a controversial theatrical experiment into an anthem of national pride.
Over the decades, the physical performance of the work evolved dramatically as well.
What started as a modest 50-person ensemble in Dublin grew into massive 800-person Victorian spectacles at the Crystal Palace.
Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart even created an updated orchestration for it decades later.
Mozart added clarinets, trombones, and French horns to suit the heavier, more symphonic tastes of later classical audiences.
Which changed the texture of the piece, making it sound thicker and more robust than the lighter Baroque orchestration Handel originally penned.
What remains constant, regardless of the size of the choir or whether you are hearing Handel's original strings or Mozart's added trombones, is the deeply human emotional journey the music dictates.
It moves from dark, anxious prophecies to the joyous nativity through the intense sorrow of the Passion and ends with ultimate triumph and hope.
We have traced a remarkable historical journey today. We started with a rebellious boy playing a smuggled, whisper-quiet instrument in a dusty attic.
We followed him as he became an anxious, desperate, aging composer who wrote a masterpiece that would literally pay to release prisoners, feed the hungry, and clothe the orphan.
Handel's humanity shines through to the very end of his story. In his final years, he suffered from cataracts and eventually went completely blind.
Despite his failing health, he attended a performance of Messiah just days before his death in 1759.
In a final lasting act of charity, he left his personal conducting score and the performance rights to the Foundling Hospital for Orphans in London.
A fitting end for a piece born out of his own professional desperation.
Absolutely.
It leaves you with a lingering, provocative thought to mull over. If Charles Jennens had not been fighting a fierce philosophical war against deism, or if the London Italian opera scene had not financially collapsed around Handel, would we even have this unified cultural soundtrack today?
It forces you to look at every great piece of historical art and wonder.
Does true brilliance emerge from pure inspiration, or does it require a profound personal crisis to force it into existence?